Hey everyone, welcome back. I hope you've all had a great couple of weeks. If you are new here, please consider subscribing if you end up liking this video. I have another cult case for you guys today. This may be the worst, most messed up case I've ever heard of. It's definitely the worst case I've ever covered here on this channel. So today we're talking about a cult most famously known as the Narco-Satanists. And this cult was led by a man named Adolfo Constanzo. And Adolfo practiced a religion called Palo Mayombe. There are a lot of strange rituals and beliefs associated with this religion, and a lot of it revolves around something called an nganga, which is essentially just an iron cauldron. People in the Palo Mayombe religion believe that this cauldron can be brought to life by making blood sacrifices, and Adolfo practiced this religion in the most evil way possible. This case is most famously known for the murder of Mark Kilroy. Mark was an American spring breaker who just vanished out of nowhere in the crowded streets of Matamoros in Mexico.
We kind of got separated and Billy kind of left Mark behind. We all came back to look for Mark and he was missing and hadn't really seen him since.
But there is a lot more to this case. This cult was scary. It was literally a cult of serial killers. The things that these people go on to do is the stuff of nightmares. And I can't give you a big enough warning for this video. Lots of horrific things are going to be discussed throughout the entire video. And I know that some of you will not watch if there's any mention of harm to animals. So just so you guys know, that is something that we're going to have to talk about in this video. I don't go into detail, but it is something that we will have to discuss. And now let's just go ahead and jump in. But before we get into today's case, I'd like to tell you all about today's sponsor, Bright Cellars. Bright Cellars is a monthly wine club that matches members with top quality wines sourced from all over the world. I cannot tell you how many times I've been at a liquor store before a party and I literally just stand in the middle of the wine aisle and stare blankly because I have no idea what I'm looking at. There are so many different types and brands and flavors. Personally, it just gets overwhelming fast. But part of the beauty of Bright Cellars is that they take all of the guesswork out of the wine buying experience. All you need to do is go to the Bright Cellars website and take a short 7-question quiz. You'll answer questions about your preferences and your taste. Then Bright Cellars will reveal your matches. You can even choose an alternate wine if you think that will match your taste better. Then you just sit back and wait for your wines to arrive right on your doorstep. Bright Cellars will even replace a bottle if you get one that just doesn't really click well with you. I mostly drink wine when I'm hanging out with my friends, and the holidays are coming up really soon, which means lots of parties and get-togethers, and I'm really excited to share some of my Bright Cellars wines with my friends and get their opinions on all the different brands and flavors. And you can even gift a Bright Cellars box or a subscription for Christmas if you have someone in your life who really loves wine. This would be the perfect gift for them. I also love that Bright Cellars includes cards in the box with details about all the different wines, like which part of the world it comes from, the flavor profile, which foods pair well with it. This one is called Sprig and Rose and it's a Pinot Grigio. And the card says that the flavor profile includes lemon, green apple, green pear, and citrus blossom. That's actually really good. It's not as sweet as some of the wines that I normally drink, but I definitely taste the citrus in it. It's actually really nice. And after you try out your wines, you can rate them, which will improve your matches later on. And you can skip a month or you can cancel your subscription anytime. Bright Cellars has over 600,000 5-star reviews and nearly 3 million people have already taken the quiz and been matched with high quality, delicious wines from all over the world. And now you can join the club too and get your first 6-bottle subscription box for the low price of just $55. Just click the link in my description box to get started. And this box is normally $150, so this is really an amazing discount. Thanks to Bright Cellars for sponsoring today's video, and now let's jump into the case. On Friday, March 10th, 1989, 4 college kids, Mark Kilroy, Bradley Moore, Bill Huddleston, and Brent Martin, all packed into a car and headed down to South Padre Island, Texas for spring break. The 4 of them were childhood friends. They had grown up together in Santa Fe, Texas. Mark was 21 and he was a junior pre-med student at the University of Texas in Austin, and his 3 friends were attending other universities around Texas, but they all still stayed in touch and they tried to meet up as often as they could. They were all getting ready to graduate from college soon, and they knew that this might be their last big vacation together before they went their separate ways and, started their careers and their families. And so they decided to head down to South Padre Island, which is a huge destination spot for college students. The island is well known for being being basically one giant party during spring break. Literally thousands of college kids flock there every year. Lots of drinking and dancing and club hopping, and the close proximity to Mexico makes it easy to hop across the border to Matamoros, where the party gets even crazier. Lots of street vendors, very relaxed rules and laws. The spring breakers bring in a large amount of money for Matamoros, so a lot of times any minor law breaking is deliberately overlooked. Mark and his friends checked into the Sheraton Hotel in South Padre, and they started their fun-filled week-long vacation. After a couple of nights of partying, the guys decided to change things up a bit. So on Sunday, March 13th, they decided to drive to the nearby city of Brownsville, Texas. In Brownsville, there is a bridge called the Gateway Bridge, which connects Brownsville, Texas to Matamoros, Mexico. Thousands of college kids were crossing over into Mexico to party that night, so Mark and his friends decided to park their car in Brownsville and walk across the bridge to Mexico. And once they were in Matamoros, Mark and his friends went to a couple of different bars. They were just drinking and having a good time. And by about 2 a.m., they started feeling very drunk and tired. So they decided that they were going to go ahead and make their way back towards the bridge so they can go back into Brownsville. But as they were walking towards the bridge, they got separated. Mark and Bill were walking together, and Brad and Brent were walking together, and they had fallen behind Mark and Bill. Bill needed to pee, so he walked a bit ahead of Mark so that he could go behind one of the bars and pee really fast, thinking that he would be finishing up just as his friends were walking past on the street, which is exactly what happened. Bill came walking out from behind the bar just as his friends were passing by on the street, so Bill runs up to join them, but then he realizes that Mark is not with them, and they have no clue where he is. They can't find him anywhere. They walked the streets, they searched in the bars and in restaurants, desperately looking for Mark, but they just couldn't find him. So they decided to go ahead and cross the bridge to check and see if maybe he had walked ahead of them. Maybe he got tired of waiting and he decided to just cross the bridge and he's waiting for them at the car. But when they made it across the bridge and back to the car, he wasn't there either. And this was when they really started to panic. So Bill, Brent, and Brad ended up going to the Cameron County Police to report Mark missing. Now, at first, the police didn't really take this seriously. Since Mark was a young spring breaker, they thought that, maybe he hooked up with a girl, or maybe he found some other friends and he just wandered off. But the guys knew Mark. They were like, no, that's not in his character. We know he would never do something like that. He's a responsible person. He would never just leave like that. And he had been right there with them. He was literally there 1 minute and then just gone in the blink of an eye. Once word of Mark's disappearance made its way back to his parents in Santa Fe, they really started pushing the authorities to do something about it. And it really added pressure to the police when they discovered that Mark's uncle was a U.S. Customs agent in Los Angeles. So a huge investigation was launched into Mark's disappearance, and the authorities in Brownsville were even crossing the border into Mexico to check for Mark in hospitals and prisons. They looked for him anywhere and everywhere they could possibly think of. The Mexican authorities also got involved and they launched their own investigation, but after 3 weeks of searching, nothing had turned up. It was as if Mark Kilroy had just vanished into thin air. But then on April 1st, they finally got a lead in the case from something that at first seemed totally unrelated. The anti-narcotics agents in Mexico decided to put up a checkpoint near the city of Matamoros. Cars were just supposed to stop at the checkpoint. Authorities would just search their vehicles looking for narcotics and then send them on their way. And everything was going just as it always did with these random checkpoints until a red truck approached, and instead of stopping at the checkpoint, the driver just laid on the gas and went straight through, right past the authorities, almost as though he thought he was invisible to the police. And this is going to come back up later in the case, so just remember this. So police hopped into unmarked vehicles and they started trailing behind the red truck. They did not turn on their sirens or anything because they wanted to see where the truck would lead them. Obviously, this person had something to hide. And they watched as the truck turned down a dirt road leading to a ranch called Rancho Santa Elena, the headquarters for a well-known drug smuggling group called the Hernandez family. But it wouldn't be long before the police would discover that it wasn't just narcotics that the Hernandezes were involved in. They were members of an evil, sadistic cult led by a man named Adolfo Constanzo. And what they go on to find at this ranch is absolutely horrific. So Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo was born in Miami, Florida on November 1st, 1962. His mother was a 15-year-old little girl from Cuba named Delia. Delia had just arrived in Miami after fleeing from the Cuban Revolution. By the time that Delia gave birth to Adolfo, she was already a priestess of the Palo Mayombe religion. This religion is very prevalent in Cuba. Delia wasn't the only Palo Mayombe practitioner in town. When she came to America, there were others in the Miami area. And Delia really wanted her child to be involved in this religion. And so she started exposing him to all of her rituals and beliefs at a very, very young age. And when Adolfo was only 6 months old, Delia brought him to see a Haitian Palero. A Palero is the name given to male members of the Palo Mayombe religion, and Paleras is the name given to the female members. So this Haitian Palero grabbed baby Adolfo and he held him up in his arms and he blew smoke, cigar smoke, all around him and just sort of sat there and examined Adolfo. Delia would later say that Adolfo was completely quiet and totally unafraid of this strange man who was holding him and blowing smoke at him. And he just sort of stared back at the man with these cold black eyes. So after the Haitian Palero examined Adolfo, he told Delia that her baby was a chosen one. He was going to grow up to do great things in the Palo religion and he was going to become a very powerful person. And he offered to take Adolfo on as an apprentice and he would become Adolfo's padrino or godfather. Under his teachings, Adolfo would be exposed to all the ins and outs of the Palo Mayombe religion, the beliefs, the practices, the rituals, and he would get him ready to take his place as a chosen one day. And Delia was absolutely ecstatic. Her baby was a chosen one. He was special. So she happily agreed to let this man become Adolfo's spiritual teacher, and she took this as an honor. So as Adolfo got older, he started visiting the man constantly, and he would listen and watch everything that he said and did, completely soaking up every ounce of knowledge that his godfather was passing on to him. And some of these rituals involved animal sacrifices. So like I mentioned earlier, the centerpiece of the Palo Mayombe religion is something called an inganga, which is an iron cauldron. Each group of Palo members has their own inganga or cauldron, and this is seen as something really great and powerful. The Palero religion has no central leadership. There is no sacred text. So a lot of the practices and beliefs are left up to interpretation, and they vary from family to family. But something that is constant among all of the groups is the cauldron, the inganga. Now in the Palo religion, you either dedicate your inganga or your cauldron to good, and if you devote your inganga to good, there is no sacrificing of animals. Instead, crucifixes and holy water are added to the cauldron. It's the groups in the Palo religion that devote their cauldron to evil that require blood sacrifices. So this would typically be an animal sacrifice, usually a chicken. In some groups, it would be goats, turtles, horses, cows, cats. And the idea is that the spirit from the sacrificed animal will then inhabit the inganga and bring it to life, and the spirit will do whatever it's commanded to do. And this is the type of magic that Adolfo's padrino or godfather practiced. This man was evil, and I don't know his name, so I'm just going to refer to him as Godfather. So Adolfo's godfather made his living by helping the local drug traffickers using magic. They would pay him large amounts of money to use his magic to protect them from the authorities and to tell them the right time to make big drug deals or smuggle narcotics or whatever. In some cases, the drug dealers would even be given magical beads to wear that was supposedly supposed to make them bulletproof, just in case there was ever a shootout with the cops. And apparently this was common among drug dealers in Miami at the time. Lots of people involved in the selling and smuggling of narcotics would have someone like Adolfo's godfather on their payroll. And they fully believed that this person could protect them from getting caught or hurt. When the local narcotics unit really started to crack down on drug rings, they would report finding lots of strange altars and religious items linked to Palo Mayombe. And it was because a lot of these drug rings had someone like Adolfo's godfather working for them. There was one story that I read while I was researching this case, and it was about this really bizarre drug bust where the police raided this house and they basically cornered one of the suspects in a room in the house, and the police had their guns drawn and pointed at this man, and without even batting an eye, the man ran straight through the group of armed police and locked himself inside of a room. And this completely stunned the police because this didn't happen. People did not just push past them totally unafraid and run. They might try to run the opposite way, but never straight through them. So the man locked himself inside of a room, and this was the room where they kept all of their illegal weapons. So he grabbed a gun and he opened the door and he started firing into the group of police officers, and it turned into this huge shootout between this man and the police. The man was eventually shot and killed, but not before severely wounding some of the officers. And it turns out that this man had been given a necklace of magic beads by the Godfather that they had on their payroll. And the Godfather had told the group that these beads would make them completely bulletproof, which explains why the man ran straight through the officers. He really thought that he couldn't be touched. Adolfo's Godfather exposed him to the darkest parts of the Paulo religion. He was exposed to torture, to ritualistic sacrifices of animals. He would also go with his Godfather to rob graves and steal human body parts that he would then put into the cauldron. And Adolfo's Godfather would tell him stories about when he lived in Haiti, he would actually murder human beings in order to make these sacrifices to the cauldron. He would murder them and then harvest certain parts of their body and then put them inside of the nganga to bring it to life. Adolfo would also be beaten pretty severely by his Godfather on a regular basis, and Adolfo never showed any fear or any emotion when this would happen. It was like he was just dead inside. And keep in mind that Adolfo is very young at this point. I think he's only about 11 years old, and his mother and his Godfather would constantly reinforce the idea that anyone who didn't hold the same beliefs as them, they were the enemy, they were animals. And his mother would conduct animal sacrifices right there in the home as well, and Adolfo grew to love the stench of death. He actually really liked the smell of rotting flesh and rotting organs. His mother would sometimes reward him by giving him animals that he could then torture and kill. And this was considered a reward because then he could sacrifice the animal to appease the gods, and then they would reward him in some way. Adolfo's demeanor was also very unsettling. He never smiled, he never laughed. He was also obsessively neat and organized, even at a very young age. By like 4 years old, everything had to be perfect all the time. His room, his clothing, everything. So all of this definitely set Adolfo apart from his peers. When other kids his age from school would be off playing sports or hanging out or reading like comic books or something, Adolfo would be holed up in his room practicing dark magic and memorizing spells and the names of gods and goddesses. And eventually Adolfo started doing some really disturbing things to his classmates when they would make him angry. The day after he would have a fight with a classmate, there would be a decapitated animal sitting on their front doorstep. And eventually people in the community figured out who was responsible for this, so the local kids became really afraid of Adolfo. Now, Adolfo's birth father wasn't in the picture. He left Delia when Adolfo was only about a year old, but she did eventually meet and marry another man, and this guy was a very successful businessman, and he was also a very devout Catholic. And I have no idea how he and Delia met or if he knew about all of the Paulo stuff before he married her. I personally think that she knew he had money and she needed someone to help support her and her kid, so she probably hid some things from him, at least at first. But eventually the differences in religious practices became an issue for them. He did not approve of the animal sacrifices or the strange rituals that Delia was teaching Adolfo, but what really sent the new husband over the edge was Adolfo himself. He was straight up scared of Adolfo. This kid really creeped him out. The way he would stare off blankly, the way he never smiled, just his overall demeanor really unnerved him. And when he would bring up any concerns to Delia, she would just say, you know, you don't need to cross Adolfo, you need to just stay out of his way. And this guy was not about confrontation, so he chose to do just exactly what Delia told him to do, and he just steered clear of Adolfo. Eventually, this husband passed away from cancer, but he was very wealthy, and he left Delia a large amount of money when he died. She did eventually get married again, but this time the new stepdad was totally different than the first one. This one reacted differently to Adolfo's creepiness. It made him angry. He would beat Adolfo constantly, and when Adolfo didn't react because he was used to these types of beatings from his Godfather, it would enrage his stepdad even more, and the violence would just escalate. Delia did warn her husband not to do this because he would regret it. She would tell him that Adolfo is very powerful and he needed to just leave him alone. But the stepdad did not listen. The beatings just continued, and it was like the more Adolfo freaked him out, the worse the beatings would be. And then one day the stepdad just disappeared, literally overnight. And when anyone would ask where he had gone, Delia would tell him that they had just suddenly got divorced and he had taken off and left the country. And people did not really believe that this is true. They didn't think that this man was just there one day and then gone the next, but they knew how strange Delia and Adolfo were, and they were too afraid to like press her for any details. It really seems like Adolfo or Delia or both of them had something something to do with his disappearance. Now, as Adolfo got older and he grew into his teenage years, he started to turn some heads. All of the girls thought that he was very handsome, and this seemed to kind of soften their opinion of him a bit. He started to date girls. In fact, he got one of his girlfriends pregnant when they were both only 14 years old. The parents of the girlfriend took the baby and forced their daughter to break up with Adolfo because they didn't want anything to do with him or his family. And as Adolfo got older, he became known in the area as a medium. He had made a few predictions that had come true, and word of this had spread. And so people started to believe that he could really have mystical powers. And people would just show up at his house and they would pay Adolfo to look into their future and talk to the spirit world. And Delia was so proud because in her eyes, she could see the prophecy that Adolfo's godfather had made was actually coming true. In 1983, when Adolfo is 21 years old, he decides that he really needs a change of scenery if he's really going to make something of himself and fulfill the prophecy as the chosen one and become this powerful priest in the Palo religion. He felt like he needed to leave Miami. So he decided to make the move to Mexico City. The Palo Mayombe religion would be relatively new to people in Mexico, so he packed up and moved by himself to Mexico City, and he immediately began working on the streets reading tarot cards. And according to people close to this case, Adolfo was actually really talented with tarot readings. His predictions always seemed to come true, and his clients would be amazed by him. And he started to make a name for himself pretty much right away. Word spread through the area about this new good-looking magician from Miami and how spot on his predictions were. So this just drove more and more people Adolfo's way. And he started to get very famous, well-known people coming to him for readings. There were actors, singers, high officials within the police department, lots of well-known people in the community. His clients would want him to look into the future and tell them if and when they should release an album or if they should take a role in a movie, things like that. And Adolfo would charge these people a lot of money for these services, usually between $8,000 and $10,000 US. Now, when Adolfo arrived in Mexico City, he met a man named Martin and he started living with him. And Martin essentially became Adolfo's bodyguard. He would quietly sit near Adolfo as he would do the card readings for his clients. Martin would just step in if he ever needed to, like if a client got out of line or whatever. And then one day, a college student named Omar and his friend Jorge came to Adolfo for a reading because Omar had heard so much about this guy, and he and Jorge really wanted to see it for themselves, how great he was. And that was it. That first meeting with Adolfo sealed their fate. Omar was completely mesmerized by Adolfo. He was so impressed with everything about him, and he ended up becoming one of his most loyal followers, and he eventually also became one of his boyfriends. And this relationship between Adolfo and Omar caused some issues right off the start because Adolfo and Martin were also in a relationship, and Adolfo would deliberately cause the guys to be super jealous of each other. Like one time he wrote Martin a love letter basically telling him that he was his everything, he was his entire world, but then he would deliberately flaunt his relationship with Omar in front of Martin. Then he would just sit back and watch the two of them fight over him. Martin would show Omar the letter that Adolfo wrote him, which would then make Omar jealous, but then Omar would turn around and do something to get back at Martin. It was just a mess, just a ton of jealousy and rage between Martin and Omar. But the two of them would never ever dare to confront Adolfo about this. They would never ask him to be loyal or to stop causing fights between them because they were just totally 100% devoted to Adolfo. He had a huge hold over them, and they eventually all moved in together. Adolfo told them that he would be in a relationship with both of them, but Martin would be his man and Omar would be his woman. So he expected Martin to help him with like the business and to continue to be his bodyguard, but then he expected Omar to do all the cooking and cleaning and house stuff. And Martin had been a college student at the time when he met Adolfo. He was studying business and he just up and quit school so that he could just be with Adolfo full time. And Omar had a girlfriend when he met Adolfo, and he broke up with his girlfriend, which was a woman named Mara, so that he could be loyal to Adolfo, even though Adolfo wasn't loyal to him at all. And Mara, when Omar broke up with her, instead of being like super upset and angry with Omar and Adolfo, she instead started visiting their house because she wanted to learn all the things that Adolfo was teaching them. And then eventually she and Adolfo started sleeping together. But he really preferred men, so he really didn't want a relationship with Mara like he did with Omar and Martin. And this dynamic between the men did not go over well with Martin and Omar's families at all. Martin was still pretty young. I'm not sure how young he was at this point. I know he was was in college at the time that he met Adolfo, but his family did try to get the authorities involved, but nothing ever came of that. And then Martin's family took the approach of just trying to be supportive because they were worried that if they pressed Martin or asked any questions or tried to get him to leave, he would choose Adolfo over them and then they would lose contact with him. And I don't think that they had a problem with Martin being in a relationship with a man. I think that they could just see right through Adolfo and they could tell that he was just taking advantage of these two guys. But Martin's family did try to grin and bear it because they were just afraid of losing Martin. But one day Martin's family was having a gathering and Martin brought Adolfo and Omar with him. And Adolfo walks up to Martin's brother and gets really close to his face, and in a low voice where no one else could hear it, he whispered, "I know what you really think of me. If you try to come between me and your brother, I will cut your heart out of your chest and sacrifice it to the spirits." And considering what Adolfo goes on to do, that was not an empty threat. And this really freaked Martin's brother out, and it wasn't just what he said, it was the fact that he said it with this creepy smile on his face. Over time, Adolfo really started to show his true colors, and he became very abusive to Martin and Omar. He would beat them on a regular basis, especially Martin. Omar would try to hide when he heard Martin being beaten because he knew he was next if Adolfo saw him. And Adolfo would also do things like he would force them to dress as women and then pose so he could take pictures of them, or he would force them to wear panties and he would take pictures of that as well. At this point, Adolfo is making a lot of money. He's really made a name for himself. He's got all these very high profile clients that keep coming to him, and he would get paid thousands and thousands of dollars for these readings. He even bought Martin and Jorge each a new car, and then he took Omar on a shopping spree, and they ended up spending over $10,000 in one day. He made a lot of money doing these card readings, but the big money came in when Adolfo caught the attention of some very powerful drug dealers in Mexico City. These guys would spend $30,000 to $40,000 to have Adolfo cleanse their souls to get rid of the evil that was inside of them in this really bizarre ritual. The drug dealers believed that they would have better luck in their businesses after participating in one of these cleansing rituals. The idea was that they had been cursed or hexed by their enemies or their competitors, which would cause them bad fortune, so they needed Adolfo to perform the cleansing ritual in order to rid them of the curse. So during the cleansing ceremony, Adolfo would strip down completely naked. He would also make the client strip down completely naked. Then he would tell them to lay on this altar that he had set up, and this altar would be used for like animal sacrifices and stuff like that. So there was always just like layers and layers of old dried blood covered on this altar. Sometimes there would even be animal parts like goat heads and things like that still on the altar, but Adolfo would just make them like lay down next to it. He would then start chanting in a strange language, and while he was chanting, he would be passing both living and dead animals over the client's body. He would then kill the living animal, then he would pull out an egg and pass the egg over the person's body. He would pass the egg under the client's arms and legs like over and over again. And the egg was supposed to be the thing that trapped the evil that was hiding inside of the person. And then suddenly Adolfo would stop chanting and he would crack open the egg and a bloody eye would fall out. I don't know where he got this eye from. It could have come from a dead animal or maybe even a dead person, and he somehow got it inside of the egg. Or maybe he was hiding the eye somewhere and he just made it look like the eye had come out of the egg. I don't know, but he would tell the client that it was the evil eye that he had pulled from their body, and now they were cleansed of the evil. And the clients would be so happy and relieved to have the evil cleansed from their bodies. And like I said, Adolfo charged a lot for these cleansing ceremonies. He would charge anywhere between $30,000 and $40,000. And all of these rituals and ceremonies seemed to work. The clients would have good luck. The drug dealers were successful in smuggling and dealing drugs. Everything seemed to be going really well for Adolfo. So well, in fact, that he started to attract a small group of loyal followers. They referred to him as their padrino. He was the godfather. He finally had his own group of followers. And this is really when the cult starts to take shape. Adolfo taught his followers all about his rituals and his beliefs, and they would participate in the animal sacrifices. But pretty soon, animals just weren't enough. Adolfo started to think that sacrificing humans would be the ultimate blood sacrifice. Having a human being spirit bringing the Nganga to life would be much more powerful than any animal spirit. So Adolfo started sacrificing humans to the cauldron, and the way he did this was absolutely horrific. The pain and terror that his victims felt is just unimaginable. Adolfo would strip off all of his clothes and he would make his followers strip theirs off too. He would then torture, sodomize, and mutilate his victims. One of Adolfo's favorite forms of torture was flaying and scalping his victims. He would cut into the scalp and then slowly peel the skin. Sometimes he would peel it off all the way down the torso. He would also cut off the penis and the testicles of all of his victims, and this was all done while they were still alive. Adolfo believed that it was really important that they tortured the victims before they kill them because they needed to die in agony and fear. If the person died in agony and fear, then the spirit that inhabited the cauldron would be even more powerful and it would serve its master loyally forever. And after the victim had been repeatedly sodomized and their bodies were mutilated beyond recognition, Adolfo would cut into their chest and pull out their hearts, and then of course they would finally die. Adolfo and his followers would then drink the blood directly from the heart. Adolfo believed that this was the best way to consume blood from a heart, was while it was fresh, it was still inside of the heart, and it was even better if the heart was still beating. Once the victim was dead and their bodies were absolutely destroyed, Adolfo would then harvest the most valuable parts of the body, and this usually included the fingers, the toes, the tibia, and the spinal column and the brain. Most of these body parts would be put into the nganga or cauldron, and this next part hasn't been confirmed by the members, but people who have looked into this case believe that Adolfo and his cult members may have cannibalized the victims as well. And it's believed that the brain would be boiled in blood before parts of it would be eaten. Then the body parts that they cut off would be put into the cauldron along with 28 sticks. Once the sacrificial ceremony was over, the body would be cut up into sections, then discarded. And now the spirit was in the cauldron, ready to do the bidding of its master, which was now Adolfo. And Adolfo would then command the spirits to do various things, like to protect them from ever being discovered or causing the death of an enemy, things like that. And in the 2 years before the murder of Mark Kilroy, the police in Mexico City started finding bodies in the Zampango River. They ended up finding a total of 8 bodies, and these bodies were completely mutilated beyond recognition. They were tied up with wire and blocks of cement. All of the corpses were missing their brains and their hearts, all of their fingers, their tibias, and their spines. They were all missing their penises and their testicles, and most of the bodies had also been flayed. We actually still don't know how many victims there were at this point. 8 bodies were found in the river, but there were probably a lot more buried in various areas around Mexico City. So Adolfo is now officially the leader of a cult of serial killers. And if I didn't know that this was 100% a true story, I probably wouldn't even believe this. It just sounds way too far-fetched. The things that Adolfo and his followers were doing just sound unreal. And I think I forgot to mention this, but Adolfo would tell his followers that their souls were dead, and this was supposed to make them unbothered by the horrific murders that they were participating in. It was supposed to make them feel like they weren't human anymore, so they didn't need to have any human emotions. And things just went on like this for a while. The group would find a victim, murder them in the worst way imaginable, and then sacrifice them to the cauldron. But by 1987, Adolfo decided that he wanted to recruit a woman to help them to lure more men in to be sacrificed. And this is when Adolfo meets a very important person in today's case, a 22-year-old college student named Sarah Aldretti. She attended the community college in Brownsville, and she made really good grades. She was super outgoing, very driven. All of her teachers thought really highly of her, and they just knew that she was going places. But Sarah was secretly struggling, and she started looking for something new, something exciting in her life. And one day in 1987, she just happened to run into Adolfo Constanzo on the streets of Matomoros, and she fell for him instantly. And she became the godmother in the cult. She's also been referred to as a cult witch and a priestess, so I'm not really sure exactly what she would be classed as, but she's been referred to as all of these things. So she would attend college courses during the day and be this perfect student, this sweet person to all of her school friends, very family oriented. She would participate in various clubs on campus, but then once class was over and she crossed the border back into Mexico, she would go see Adolfo and she would become the godmother in his cult of serial killers. And Sarah proved to be very valuable to Adolfo because she had connections to one of the brothers of a well-known group of drug dealers called the Hernandez family. Sarah had dated one of the Hernandez brothers named Elio Hernandez, and she had some pretty interesting information for Adolfo. The oldest Hernandez brother and the leader of the family drug business had died about 7 months earlier, and ever since then, the business for the Hernandez brothers had began to go downhill. They just couldn't figure out the business formula that their older brother had down, known, he was really the brains of the entire operation. So their business looked like it was on track to go under very soon. And this was like music to Adolfo's ears. He knew that he could really take advantage of the Hernandez family because they would be so desperate to save their business. He knew that they would pay whatever and do whatever in exchange for his services. This was his goal. He wanted to manipulate, control, and lead a drug smuggling gang. He knew how lucrative this would be for him, and the bonus was that he would automatically gain a larger following in his cult. So Sarah convinced Elio to meet up with Adolfo, and she told him that Adolfo was a witch and he was very powerful and that he could help the Hernandez family drug business. And Elio took the bait and he agreed to meet Adolfo. And of course, Elio and the others were impressed by Adolfo and they accepted his help with their business. So Adolfo does some of his ceremonies and rituals and stuff, and their drug business actually started improving and they were seeing more and more money come in. Now, the theory here is that Adolfo told the Hernandezes that they were invisible to authorities, and so this gave them more confidence, like a false sense of security, to take more chances on more drug deals, and that's why their business had improved. It was mostly just luck. But the Hernandezes were so impressed and they were like, this is great. We need to be in constant contact with Adolfo. He's the reason why we're doing so much better. But Adolfo didn't want to be on their payroll. He wanted full control of the Hernandez drug operation. So he offered to keep the family and the business protected in exchange for 50% of their profits, and he wanted to call all the shots in the business. And they agreed to these terms. This is how desperate they are. They basically just gave half of their business away, and now they have this new leader that they just met. They didn't even really know him, but they were desperate and they were also really impressed with Adolfo. And soon Rancho Santa Helena, the place where the Hernandez family operated, would be the site for over a dozen brutal murders orchestrated by Adolfo Constanzo. So I'm not going to introduce every single person in this cult because it would just take too long, and honestly it's just not necessary, but there are a couple of people that you do need to know. So little Serafin Hernandez is related to the Hernandez family. He was 21 years old at the time and he was attending Brownsville College. Malio Torres was another member of the Hernandez family and he was also a student. And of course, Elio Hernandez, who we have already discussed. Now, the Hernandez family didn't know that Adolfo was sacrificing people, at least at this point. They didn't know that the 8 mutilated corpses that were found in the river were Adolfo's victims, but it wasn't long before Adolfo involved them in a murder and sacrifice of a person. And this was someone that they all knew. It was Jorge's roommate, a man named Ramon Esquivel. Ramon and Jorge had a falling out over their apartment. Jorge wanted Ramon to move out and to pay his share of the rent, but Ramon had refused. And when Adolfo found out about this, he decided that Ramon would be their first victim and sacrifice together. He would show the Hernandez family what type of sacrifices he was actually into. So one night after Ramon got home from work, Adolfo grabbed him and threw him into the bathtub. He then got a knife and started peeling off Ramon's skin. He also cut off his penis and his testicles before slitting his throat. He then collected Ramon's blood into a jug. He cut off his fingers and his toes, his shin bone, and his brain was also removed. And all of this would be saved and then transported back to Rancho Santa Elena to be offered to the cauldron. And after this murder, the Hernandez family, they were terrified of Adolfo, but they were also still obsessed with him and making him happy. And the killing started to get easier and easier each time they found someone to sacrifice. On the property, they had this like little shack that they set up, and this is where the cauldron would stay. And this is also where Adolfo and the cult members would sacrifice people. There seemed to be no real rules when it came to choosing a victim. They would kill total strangers. They would find someone maybe walking down the street near the ranch. They would maybe offer this person a job. The stranger would then accept. And then when they arrived on the ranch, he would sacrifice each person in the exact same way. Or sometimes Sarah would seduce a victim to try to lure them onto the ranch to be killed. They would kidnap and kill rival drug dealers. They would even do this to their own family members. Adolfo actually murdered one of the Hernandez's 14-year-old cousins. There just didn't seem to be any rules in this cult. Like anyone was fair game. All of the victims are male, by the way. I don't know if I've mentioned that yet, but all of the people that Adolfo targeted, they were male. And this pattern just repeated itself for over a year. But then one day in March of 1989, Adolfo told his followers that the cauldron was asking for a different type of victim. This time, the cauldron wanted a young American spring breaker, and even better if he was blonde. And I think the fact that the cauldron asked specifically for a young blonde man proves that Adolfo was doing at least some of this for his own pleasure. I think that he just wanted to sexually assault a blonde man. Like, why would the cauldron ask for a blonde? I don't know. I might be reading too much into that, but Adolfo is just so sick and twisted. I wouldn't be surprised if that was why he asked for a specific hair color. But this is when Seraphine and the rest of the cult members set out to find what the cauldron was asking for. And of course, this is when they spot Mark Kilroy in the crowded streets of Matamoros. And based on the confessions that the cult members would later make, this is what happened that night that Mark disappeared. On the night of March 10th, Mark and his three friends Brad, Billy, and Brent parked their car in Brownsville. Then they crossed the Gateway Bridge into Matamoros to party with over 50,000 other spring breakers. They bar hopped until about 2 a.m. Then they realized how drunk and exhausted they were, so they all decided it was time to make their way back to Brownsville. So they all started walking down the very crowded street towards the Gateway Bridge. Bill suddenly had to pee, so he ran ahead of Mark so he could go relieve himself behind one of the bars along the street. And sadly, this is when Mark caught the eye of the cult members. They had been sent out that night to look for a young American spring breaker to sacrifice. And when they spotted Mark, not only did he fit the mold perfectly in terms of his appearance and his age, he was also all alone. And he was obviously very intoxicated, which meant that he would be easy to trick and he would also be easy to overpower. So in that very short window, when Bill left Mark on the street so that he could go use the restroom, Mark started wandering around. He was just kind of in a fog because he was so drunk. And this is when Seraphine pulls up near him and says something to the effect of, "Hey, you look like you could use a ride." And in that moment, the thought of having to continue the long walk to the car all the way on the other side of the Gateway Bridge, it just seemed like such a daunting task. So Mark says, yes, I could use a ride. I'm super drunk right now. I don't even know what's going on. And so Seraphine tells Mark, it's no problem at all. We'll take you where you need to go so you don't have to walk. So Mark climbs into the truck and they start driving down the street away from all the bars and the crowds. And now Mark Kilroy has just unknowingly, voluntarily gotten into a car with members of a serial killing cult. And now they're just driving down the road. And at first, everything seems to be totally fine. They're talking, they're getting along just fine. And at this point, Mark didn't seem to be suspicious in any way. But then Seraphine pulls off the road and he says, I need to take a leak. So he stops and he and Malio, who was also in the truck with him, they get out of the truck and they walk off a little ways. And at that point, Mark must have sensed that he was in danger. He knew something wasn't right. So he gets out of the truck and he bolts. He starts running as fast as he can towards the border. Seraphine and Malio, they see this and they start yelling at Mark to freeze, just like an officer would say. And that's what Mark thought was happening. He thought that these guys were actually undercover police officers and maybe he was in trouble for being so intoxicated. So he obeyed their order and he stopped. Another car had pulled up during all of this as well, and that car was full of more cult members who were just trailing behind Seraphine's truck, and they saw Mark get out and run, so they had pulled up and they were also telling him to freeze. So they go and grab Mark and they tell him that he's in big trouble because he's just too drunk and he tried to run, just basically playing up the officer act. Then they put duct tape over Mark's eyes and his mouth and they tied his ankles and wrists together. Then they put him in the back of a truck and they made their way to Rancho Santa Elena. Now, Adolfo and Sarah were not at Matamoros at the time. They couldn't sacrifice Mark. They had to wait on them to arrive. So they just left Mark in the back of the truck. And the whole time that all of this is happening, Seraphine was telling Mark that he was going to be totally fine. Nothing bad was going to happen to him, just giving him false hope that he would actually make it out alive. The next morning, the caretaker arrives and he sees Mark all tied up and he knows that bad stuff is happening here. He never asks any questions. He's not a member of the cult. He was just there to keep up with the animals and take care of the property. He just keeps his head down and he does his job because he's terrified of Adolfo. So he sees Mark in the back of the truck and he's all tied up. He's got tape over his eyes, tape over his mouth, and he can't help but feel sorry for this kid. And he knows that something really bad is probably getting ready to happen. He's probably not going to make it out alive. So he goes and gets some eggs and some bread and water, and he pulls down the tape over Mark's mouth and he starts feeding him the food. Now, Mark is desperately trying to tell the caretaker what's going on, that he needs help, he's been kidnapped, but the caretaker didn't speak a word of English, so he didn't really know what Mark was saying. But it likely wouldn't have mattered. He wasn't about to interfere with whatever Adolfo was doing. He was just too scared. So after he was done feeding Mark and giving him water, he just put the tape back over his mouth and just left him there and never mentioned anything to anyone until much later, but we'll talk about that in a bit. So Adolfo and Sarah finally arrive around noon, and this is when Mark Kilroy is murdered in the most horrific way. Adolfo ordered his followers to drag Mark into the shack. Adolfo then stripped off all of his clothes and all of Mark's clothes. He then sodomized Mark over and over again before cutting off his genitals. Adolfo then grabbed a machete and hacked into Mark's skull to remove his brain, which of course is what ultimately killed him. His brain was then tossed into the cauldron as an offering to make the spirits smarter. Once it was over, Adolfo ordered the others to take care of the body, but he told them to be sure to salvage Mark's spine because Adolfo wanted to make it into a necklace. So they cut off Mark's legs below the knees, his feet were cut off, his head was cut off, his heart was cut out, and of course they used all the body parts that they wanted to feed the cauldron. A wire string was tied to Mark's spine before it was buried with the other parts of his body, and they would leave the wire sticking out of the ground so that they could find the spine later. They would leave the spine buried for a while so the flesh would come off easier, then they would make a necklace out of it. Then 3 weeks after Mark's murder on April 1st, Seraphine decided to run right through that checkpoint, which tipped off the authorities and ultimately led to them being arrested. And now it makes sense why Seraphine ran through that checkpoint, because he thought he was invisible from authorities because that's what Adolfo told him. So after he drove through that checkpoint and police secretly followed him to the ranch, they decided to get back up before just storming in. They knew it could get ugly. But at this point, remember, they have no clue that this ranch is connected in any way to the Mark Kilroy case. They think that they are just about to bust a large drug smuggling ring. So they get back up and they go out to the ranch, and the only person there to talk to is the caretaker, the one that had fed Mark Kilroy. So they started questioning the caretaker. Now, this guy was not giving them much information at all. He knew that he needed to keep his mouth shut because he knew that if Adolfo even thought for a second that he was helping the police, he knew what would happen to him. So the police look around and they, talk to the caretaker for a while, and then they tell the caretaker, look, we're going to go ahead and go, but please do not mention any of this to whoever lives here, to the Hernandez family. Don't tell them that we're here sniffing around. And the caretaker says, of course I won't say anything, and then the police leave. But as soon as the police left, the caretaker told the cult members what was going on. So it kind of tipped them off that the police were definitely sniffing around the property. By April 11th, the police had gotten all the warrants that they needed to search the property, so they returned back to the ranch. And when they got there, they found drugs in a large warehouse, at least 200 pounds of marijuana, and traces of cocaine. Now, Adolfo and Sarah and a couple of other cult members, they left. As soon as they heard what the caretaker had to say about the police kind of sniffing around the ranch, they took off. But they did find 4 of the cult members there at the ranch, and this included Seraphine, so the 4 of them were arrested and taken down to the jail. Again, at this point, they were only suspected of being involved in a large drug operation. They still have no clue about the Mark Kilroy connection. They also took the caretaker down to the station for questioning, and so they started asking him more questions about the Hernandezes and all the drugs and stuff. But as they're talking to the caretaker, they notice that he's just staring at this flyer of Mark Kilroy. And when they ask him, what's going on, is everything okay? He says, I know that kid. He's been out to the ranch. And this is when the police finally make the connection. They knew now that the men that they had just taken into custody were likely responsible for Mark's disappearance. So the police started questioning the cult members about all of this, and they were so smug during their questioning. They told the officers that their souls were dead and they wouldn't be able to keep them in custody because they were protected. And the way that they were talking about Mark's murder was just so chilling.
He got in the truck and then he went to use the restroom, and when we got up, he started running. And then the other guy was kind of, why did he do it? Why did he do that? What was that? Why did he do that? And then took him to the ranch. And what? What happened at the ranch? What happened at the ranch? Yeah. What did y'all do to him? Well, I ended up, but the other one, they killed him.
At one point, Seraphine was giving an account of what happened to Mark, and he actually says that he heard a boom like the sound of a coconut cracking, and that's when he knew Mark's skull was being cracked open. Just so uncaring, unfeeling, just no emotion at all. Seraphine was the one most willing to talk out of all the cult members. He was just telling the police anything and everything they wanted to know because, again, he thought that they were protected and he would never have any jail time. Now, at this point, the police still don't know about the other victims. They think that it's just Mark that's out there on the ranch. So they tell Seraphine that he's going to go down to the ranch with them, and Seraphine is going to show them where Mark is buried. So they take Seraphine down to the ranch, and he finds that wire that they left hanging out of the ground. Remember the wire that they tied to Mark's spine so they could pull it up later to make a necklace? And so they hand Seraphine a shovel and they tell him to start digging, and he did. And eventually his shovel hit bone, and that's when they found what was left of Mark Kilroy. Dental records did confirm that this was in fact Mark. And as all of this is going on, the officers start looking around and they see several mounds of dirt that look like it could be more grave sites. So they turn to Seraphine and they're like, Mark isn't the only victim, is he? There are others buried here. And Seraphine confirms that yes, there are others buried at the ranch. In the end, they found 15 horribly mutilated and dismembered bodies buried on or near the ranch. And one of the victims had been abducted and murdered after Mark Kilroy. And Seraphine just continued to give up all the details about the cult, including who their leader was. So now the police were desperately trying to find this Adolfo Constanzo and Sarah Aldrete. The authorities in Mexico found Adolfo's passport, and Seraphine told police the alias that Adolfo would use when he was traveling, and they managed to trace his steps all the way to Mexico City. Adolfo and Sarah and a few other cult members were hiding there. The police in Mexico City start hunting all over for them. They made flyers and they posted them all over the city, and their faces were also plastered all over the news. But there were no leads. There was nothing. So the police in Matomoros, they come up with another plan. They decide that they needed to rattle Adolfo a little bit, really get him angry and scared, and maybe he would slip up and blow his cover. There was a witch doctor back in Matamoros who offered to kill Adolfo's Nganga by setting it on fire. To someone like Adolfo, who fully believed that the Nganga held spirits that protected him from getting caught, this would be devastating. And they decided to do all of this on air, hoping that Adolfo would see it. So the witch doctor, along with a big filming crew and several officers, went out to the ranch. The witch doctor poured gasoline all around the shack, all over the cauldron, and before he lit the match, he threw a photo of Adolfo inside the cauldron. Then he lit the match and everyone watched as it went up in flames. And all of this was caught on camera. All of the local news stations were showing this on air, and Adolfo was holed up in an apartment in Mexico City watching the entire thing on TV, and he was just absolutely losing his mind. He went crazy. He started panicking because he lost all of his protection. All of the spirits were gone. All the spirits that had been there to protect him, they were gone. And not long after this, Sarah was actually spotted outside in Mexico City by some people on the street. The locals had seen the hundreds of flyers all over the city. They had seen the nonstop news coverage. And also, I think I forgot to mention this, but Sarah was 6'1", so this was a very identifiable feature. So someone spots Sarah as she's walking down the street, and they go and alert police that they just saw the wanted woman Sarah Aldrete, and they saw that she went into this specific apartment building. And the police wasted no time. They completely surrounded the building and they were all ready to fire. But was Adolfo finally going to give up in the face of several armed officers? No. Instead, he grabbed a machine gun and has a shootout with the police. In the end, though, Adolfo was killed during the shootout. I've read conflicting accounts, though. Some sources say that he ordered one of his followers to shoot him in the head during the standoff with police, and other sources say that he was actually killed by the police. But whatever the case, Adolfo Constanzo was finally dead. Sarah Aldrete was found in the next room hiding, and she was taken into custody. The surviving cult members who were also there with Adolfo were taken in as well. And Sarah had the nerve to deny any involvement. She tried to tell them that she was actually a hostage, that she had been kept in that apartment against her will. She even had the audacity to get on TV and say that she was so worried when she heard about Mark Kilroy's disappearance that she even joined in the search and handed out flyers. And if that is true, and she actually joined Mark's family in the search for him as if she had no clue that he was buried out in Rancho Santa Elena, then that just shows you how absolutely sadistic Sarah really was. In the end, no one believed Sarah's story, and she was sentenced to 62 years in prison. The members of the cult that the police were actually able to track down, including Seraphine and Elio Hernandez, they were all sentenced to 67 years in prison, and there are actually still 2 cult members to this day that have never been found. Mark's mom and dad were absolutely devastated by the death of their son, but they were very faithful people and they tried to see the good in the situation. They said that if it hadn't have been for Mark, Adolfo Constanzo might never have been caught, and it was his murder that led to the downfall of the cult. In addition to the 15 bodies found at or near the ranch and the 8 mutilated bodies found a couple of years earlier in the river, Adolfo and his cult have also been linked to the murders of 16 children in Mexico City. All of the children were age 16 or younger, and their bodies had been ritualistically tortured. There is no confirmation that Adolfo was the killer in these 16 murders, but based on the state of the bodies and the time frame, many people believe that he was responsible. And that was the case of Adolfo Constanzo and his cult of serial killers. That was a very heavy case. Thank you so much if you made it to the end. Let me know what you guys think about this one down in the comments. Don't forget to check out Bright Cellars by clicking the link in my description box, and you'll get your first 6-bottle box for only $55. If you find this type of content interesting, please consider subscribing and following me on Instagram at summer_SanchezYT. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.